Well, here we are at the end of a decade. The 2010s are coming to a close, and what a wild ride it was. We saw the rapid and rampant expansion of social media. We've seen protests, violent revolutions and uprisings, civil wars, a resurgence in oil production, the narrow beginning of space tourism after a decade and a half of delays. We saw a lot of interesting stuff, but now the 2020s are about to begin. Less than 48 hours from now, as of me recording this, and as of you being able to watch it, probably less than 4 hours from now. And as noise from outside the building beyond my control potentially filters into my microphone, we're going to dive in and take a look at the decade ahead, the title of this video. We're going to look at things that are likely coming in the next 10 years over the 2020s, the official start of the future, and some of these being my own predictions and forecasts of a sort, and others being things that are just straight up going to happen, one way or the other, whichever category each falls into. Here we go. So to start with, to tie into recent events, things such as the essential burning down of Eastern Australia, and in recent years the repeated and relentless destruction of the Caribbean by strong tropical cyclones. As we progress through the 2020s, the repeated beatings from intensifying climate-related disasters are going to continue, and they're going to get worse. Now that hopefully should be one of the more obvious things. We've experienced the first hammer stroke. It wasn't as bad as it's going to get. It was more like the Smith, taking just the first swing down to get a feel for the hammer. Now, as the 2020s come about, we're just about to start taking one beating after another as the hammer strokes come down one by one by one by one. So extreme weather events and climate-related disasters are going to continue, going to intensify. Places like California and Australia are going to keep burning down. The Caribbean is going to keep getting hammered. The heat waves are going to keep coming and keep pushing up electricity demand, keep straining infrastructure. The financial burden on society from the repeated and intensifying damage from all of these things is going to be greatly exacerbated as time keeps going forward. And we are still relatively in a frame of reality for the moment where both time, resource, and money-wise, we can afford to keep reconstructing, to keep putting things back together after it all gets knocked down. However, as we keep moving into the future, probably starting towards the end of the 2020s, it's going to start getting into a point where instead of being below par, it's going to be on par with our ability to keep putting everything back together, and eventually it's going to start surpassing our ability to keep up with it. And so obviously there's going to be repeated evacuations, and people are inevitably going to get tired of it, and you're going to start seeing population flight from various regions. Obviously the regions with the most recurring extremes. Now, slightly tied into that, because it's not entirely climate-related but also population-related, is you're going to see similar things happening in correlation with water supply issues. You're already actually seeing this in numerous regions of India, which for India in particular is both a combined 1-2 punch from drought and extreme excessive levels of population. However, that's not the only area where this is going to be occurring. India's situation is going to get much, much worse over the 2020s. However, water issues are going to begin arising and are going to become much less ignorable in numerous other regions as well, forcing either population flight or extreme solutions that inevitably cause different further problems down the line. Australia is one location that is in for quite a bit. The southwestern U.S. has always had this coming. Much of the Middle East and northern Africa has this problem already, particularly on the Arabian Peninsula. They have emptied out most of their ancient groundwater aquifers, and many of them are now turning over to building massive desalination plants, sucking dozens of millions of gallons of salt water out of the surrounding seas and oceans each day, desalinating them, having that water cycle through society, and then inevitably dumping a bunch of fresh water into a naturally saltwater ecosystem. And though that would mainly have localized effects, that's still going to cause some ecological problems for the saltwater areas where all of that fresh water is then dumped back into. And speaking of populations, we have quite a bit of lines that are going to be crossed in 2020. Vietnam and Egypt are going to cross up and over 100 million people. Mexico is going to hit 150 million. The US is going to be at or just under 350 million. Indonesia will be just under 300 million. Nigeria will be right up near 250 million. Brazil, 240 million. India, over 1.4 billion. They're going to be passing China by the end of the 2020s. China, thankfully, at least will be finally peaking, likely somewhere between 1.44 and 1.46 billion. On some smaller milestones, Australia will be hitting 30 million. The UK will be hitting 70 million. Canada will be hitting 40 million. Argentina, 50 million. Saudi Arabia, 40 million. Iraq, 50 million. Turkey and Iran, each 90 million. The world will be exceeding 8 billion, likely at 8.3 or 8.4 by the end of the 2020s. Okay, guys, we gotta stop. Okay, please, we have to stop. Now, this continuing grand addition of people, along with the continued uplifting of people out of third and second world status into second and first world living standards, is going to continue causing additional problems and additional supply strains, many of which will just be beginning to actually inflict their first real tangible effects in the 2020s. So basically, a proper decade title for the upcoming 2020s would just be "It Begins," or "It Has Begun." India and China, again, India population-wise will be passing China in the 2020s in terms of their level of oil demand, oil consumption. India at the moment averages around 5 million barrels per day. During the 2020s, they will get up to and exceed 10 million barrels per day. China, currently averaging 14 million barrels per day, is going to get up and over 20 million barrels per day, and may, by the end of the 2020s, be just under or tying the U.S.'s current level of consumption, which is around 22 million barrels per day. Thankfully, and finally, during the 2020s, U.S. oil consumption will likely peak between 23 and 24 million barrels per day. And no one's really going to grow in consumption or demand by all too much after that, because they're going to have a big constraining factor. That constraining factor being, during the mid to late 2020s, global oil production will hit its second and very likely final peak. Now, we already experienced the first peak between 2005 and 2008, when global oil production flatlined and demand overshot it by 2 million barrels per day towards the end of that period. And we all know what came about as a result of that. I'm pretty sure we're well aware. We call it the end of the prosperity age. Now, we have a specific video detailing the hows and why of that, called Why the Good Old Days Are Never Coming Back. A link to that is now up in the corner, or there should be one at the end of this video. If you want to go watch that, please do. Or rather listen, it's more of a podcast or audiocast type thing. But mid to late 2020s, the second and final global oil production peak. And I do rather expect, with the kind of price surges that we're going to see as a result of that we'll be able to bring enough production online from far offshore, extreme environment, and even further unconventional things, to sort of keep that bumpy flat line in as gradual of a decline as possible for a little while. Most likely at least a fair way into the 2030s, but the 2030s will get their own different video a different time. However, the supply growth stall and demand overshoot is obviously going to have a similar effect as the last time. The price is going to surge, and I expect during the 2020s at its height is probably going to get up to somewhere between $208 and $238 per barrel. And then it'll actually likely even drop back below that for a time as global demand contracts as a result of those prices. However, then as the 2020s end and the 2030s begin, it will resume an up and down pattern and inevitably hit higher prices in the 2030s. However, again, that'll get its own video another time. Specifically for US viewers, this will translate for you in the mid to latter part of the 2020s, seeing gasoline prices of between $5 and $8 per gallon. Now, within the oil production trend of the 2020s, some specific things regarding individual nations will be happening. Saudi Arabia, as the 2020s end, will be hitting the end of their ability to maintain their oil production plateau of 10 million barrels per day. They might push that off into the 2030s if they're lucky. However, before that actually happens, I suspect that they will do a gradual step down. Guyana, over the 2020s, will rise into some minor prominence, primarily given how massive their export ratio is going to be, since their own oil consumption levels domestically are only about 15,000 barrels per day. And as discoveries continue, I'm expecting inevitably Guyana's going to get up to a peak of between 1.1 and 1.2 million barrels per day of production, most likely at the very end of the 2020s, before then beginning to decline. Kazakhstan has been rising over the past couple decades or so, and will come to its peak in the 2020s, likely between 2.6 and 2.8 million barrels per day. The US will hit its second peak during the 2020s as well, most likely around or a bit below 14 million barrels per day. Russia will also most likely lose their ability to maintain their 11 to 12 million barrel per day plateau. However, natural gas, while it will not peak completely in the 2020s, by the end of the 2020s, it will be beginning to peak. Its actual peak globally will probably be during the 2030s, but the beginnings of it will come probably in the later 2020s. Although with the rapid abandonment of coal-fired power generation and constant switching of everything over to natural gas-fired power generation, and switching over to natural gas heating from older and or more expensive things like heating oil and propane tanks, there is likely going to be a bit of a natural gas demand overshoot. Although with the way natural gas works, that will probably be a bit more regionally dependent. But towards the end of the 2020s, you'll probably start seeing a upsurge in natural gas prices, back up into something between $9 and $17 per 1,000 cubic feet. Now, on the last little bit connected to energy, the total number of cars in the world, which is just now hitting 1.2 billion, will by the end of the 2020s likely hit and exceed 1.5 billion cars. Now, that's just cars, mind you. Just personal automobiles, not including buses, freight trucks, construction vehicles. We will be approaching and hitting 1.5 billion cars. The number of aircraft in the skies over the world at any given time will also continue rising. Now, granted, it has a very wide variable range depending on time of day and also depending on time of year, which season. Currently, at least over the course of this year, fluctuating widely between, at the highest point I saw, 21,178 aircraft in the air, and at the lowest point, about 9,800 aircraft in the air. The high point by the end of the 2020s, I expect, will inevitably exceed 25,000. as more people rise out of third and second world status and into the ability to afford to travel long distances, and as population growth continues, as there are just more and more people to begin with, the amount of people traveling will continue to increase. However, the rate at which global jet fuel demand is increasing is not as quickly, because at the moment, many older, higher fuel burn rate aircraft are being retired from service and replaced with newer, far more fuel-efficient aircraft, such as, for example, Delta Airlines replacing all of their 30 to 40-year-old McDonnell Douglas aircraft with the new A220. The difference between the two of them being a fuel consumption rate of roughly 2.1 gallons per mile versus about 1.5 gallons per mile. So basically a 30% drop in the level of fuel consumption. And again, of course, that's just one example of. However, jet fuel has never been any large factor of global oil demand, as currently global jet fuel demand averages about 6 million barrels per day, which is less than 6% of global oil demand, as global oil demand is currently up to 101.7 million barrels per day. The majority of global oil demand is still in the form of gasoline and diesel for ground vehicles. But moving away from energy and into metals and physical resources, oil isn't the only thing that's going to be peaking in the 2020s. Global gold production from gold mines around the world will also be peaking during the 2020s. Probably not reaching 4,000 tons per year, but global gold production will peak in the 2020s, which will obviously cause a massive upshoot in gold prices, both from the demand overshoot that will inevitably result from demand continuing to grow but supply ceasing to grow, and also from just the market shock effect. So is gold going to break its price record during the 2020s when this happens? Absolutely. It's going up over 2K. It's probably even going up over 3K as a loosely defined range of what I would expect to see, at least at its height. I'd probably expect before the end of the 2020s to see gold get up to anywhere between $2,907 and $3,823 per ounce. Now, global silver production has already peaked. It peaked in 2015, and it is going to primarily continue declining through the 2020s in terms of its overall trend. Now, it will probably have a bump in there of like a handful of years clustered together maybe, where it'll climb back up a little bit before resume going down, but overall it's going to continue going down. And the market up to date has not truly reacted to this yet. And so I inevitably expect there's going to be something of a silver shock. And as a result, silver prices will spring upwards, probably at least getting up to between $47 and $76 per ounce, though with a pretty fair chance, especially in the later part of the 2020s, to go higher. Copper will not peak during the 2020s. That's not expected until the 2030s in terms of global mine production. However, its growth, similar to natural gas, as the 2020s reach their later part, will be beginning to stall, and demand also will already be beginning to constantly overshoot it off and on, as global copper demand is relentlessly expanding as a result of numerous factors. One, the remaining population of the Earth that does not have electricity access is being electrified, is being given electricity access. Two, the population of the Earth is just growing flat out, and more people means more stuff, more buildings, more electricity access. Three, even if they're just regular vehicles, just internal combustion engine vehicles, even regular cars still have a lot of copper in them, and the number of cars, as we've already said, is increasing, along with the number of other vehicles as well. And even apart from that, more things are just being built anyways. More buildings, more places, more stuff, more phones, more computers, more gaming consoles, and also the rise of electric vehicles is also going to be quickly expanding global copper demand, both from the electric vehicles themselves, as each one has nearly 200 pounds of copper contained in them, and from all the electric vehicle charging infrastructure and wiring that's going to have to be added across the world in every town and city to enable the use of electric vehicles. So although copper is not going to peak in the 2020s, it is going to be having some demand overshoot issues, again, especially the further forward you go. And so during the 2020s, I would expect to see copper prices flare up a bit, and I'd expect them at the higher end to probably spiking up into $6 to $9 per pound. For present reference, as of the moment, they're around $2.80 as of the making of this video. And another metal that's going to go into demand versus supply overshoot is nickel, for a few reasons. One, the more quickly expanding reason being the rise of electric vehicles, which is obviously going to continue into the 2020s and further expand. You see, electric vehicles use lithium-ion batteries. Now, despite the name, lithium-ion batteries barely contain any lithium. The majority of the weight in the battery is between the cathode and the anode, and the majority of that weight in terms of material is manganese and nickel. Now, nickel is also used in steel, various types of steel alloys, especially for infrastructure around oceans and seawater and ships and vessels at sea, as nickel is extremely resistant to saltwater corrosion. And also not just in those corrosion-resistant steel alloys, but in other types of steel alloys as well. Various types of, high-strength steel alloys that we need for, things like bridges and all kinds of weight-bearing infrastructure. And as third and second world nations continue rising, building modern infrastructure, and so their demand for all those various types of steel is increasing, which on top of the EV issue is also quickly increasing nickel demand. So nickel during the 2020s and onward is going to go into demand overshoot and have numerous supply issues. And nickel is going to shatter its previous records and likely during the 2020s get up to somewhere, I'd say, between $80,000 and $120,000 per ton. And let's see, what else we got? Rare earths. The rare earth metals, which are needed for so many things, just a short array of examples are indium. Indium is needed for indium tin oxide, which is what allows us to have modern screens, particularly to have modern, thin, flat screens, and not have everything require, big, huge, 40-pound, 3-foot thick monitors. Terbium is a critical dopant used to grant us the ability to have flash memory and solid-state memory. Hafnium is a critical applicant material that has allowed us to greatly increase the efficiency of our computer processors. Neodymium, dysprosium, and praseodymium are critical, very magnetic rare earth elements that are what allow us to have efficient electric motors of all sizes, from the tiny one inside your phone to the motor inside your electric razor, the motors inside portable fans, and many of the motors of electric vehicles, and also in wind turbines. And again, that's just a brief selection. But again, back on point, rare earth demand and thus rare earth prices are going to be rocketing upwards as civilization tries to become more green over the course of the 2020s. And again, as more people come into existence and need more things, more technology, and the third and second worlds continue rising into first world status, and thus gaining all of this first world stuff, demand for the various rare earth metals will continue going up, and this brief price decrease or price cushion we are seeing currently from China restarting operations at numerous rare earth metal mines, that price cushion is going to come to an end, and the rare earth prices are going to resume going upwards. Those like neodymium and praseodymium that are currently only in double digits are going to go back up into triple digits. Neodymium during the 2020s probably exceeding $250 per kilogram again, and those like terbium and dysprosium that are currently in the triple digits going back up into the quadruple digits. Dysprosium probably going up over 1100 at least at some point during the 2020s. Terbium, much rarer, probably going up over 2K. And those like hafnium, rhenium, and germanium that are already in quadruple digits going higher into quadruple digits. So that's about it in terms of a roundup. How this is going to translate into sort of your everyday life. In the later part of the 2020s, probably going to see fuel at the pump up to $5 to $8 a gallon at the higher points. In Canadian terms, probably around like $3 a liter. At that same time, during the later part of the 2020s, air travel costs obviously are going to spike up with that. At the moment, you can fly coast to coast in North America, like New York to Los Angeles, for example, for around $300. A little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what kind of deal you can get. At that point, it's probably going to shoot up to close to $1,000. Transatlantic travel, also, for example, is currently around $500. At that point, it's probably going to shoot up closer to $2,000. Your electricity costs, because of a mixture of the rising price of everything, and also constant repair expenses from constant damage from storms and environmental disasters, in U.S. terms at least, is probably going to go up from averaging around 10 cents per kilowatt. I know some of you are actually blessed enough to only have a rate that's still that low, but that average is probably going to spike upwards into anywhere between 14 and 22, which means my rate's probably going to be going up over 30 because of a mixture of the fuel price increase inevitably and increasing crop issues from the various environmental disasters. You're probably going to see food prices go up, again, especially towards the latter part of the 2020s, or maybe the mid part of the 2020s. For me, for example, at present, a loaf of bread's about $2. I'm probably going to end up seeing it between 3 and 5. And also, as the 2020s progress, we're probably going to see increasing standard of living or cost of living protests and riots like we've already been seeing in the last couple of years in places, for example, like Chile and Iran. So whatever the case, that's that. Despite the dismality of the outlook, I mean, at least we're going to space. But that's it. I hope everybody enjoyed watching or listening. Please like the video if you did enjoy, and obviously subscribe and hit the bell if you haven't already. There's other videos for you to watch, and my paypal.me is down in the description below for anyone who wants to help me out and donate any amount of money. Carving names into a giant chunk of coal didn't exactly work out all that well, so now the new thing is anyone who donates between now and some arbitrary time in April, I'll paint your names onto Easter eggs or something, I guess. But that's it from me for this one, and that's it for 2019. Let the future begin. May God bless you all. I will see you all around next time.